Dear students of class 10A and 10B, the following points, as I mentioned in the board: economic exploitation, drain of wealth, decay of cottage industries and handicrafts, economic decline of peasantry, growing unemployment. Now, economic exploitation. Economic exploitation. What is economic exploitation? What do you mean by economic exploitation? You know, India was made an agricultural colony by the British, and at the same time, the British made this country, India, an economic colony to serve the interest of themselves. Not only that, India was forced to export raw materials, means raw silk, raw cotton at cheaper rates in order to serve the interests of the British industry in England. Meanwhile, besides India, Indian plantation products like indigo, tea, its supply, its availability in England was very much less than India. That's why they utilize Indian tea, they utilize Indian cotton in order to serve the urgent need of their factories and industries of England. India was made to accept British-made goods, and in the process of importing British-made goods, there was no imposition of high revenues and taxes, but in the process of exporting Indian goods for England, there was a system of imposition of high amount of taxes and duty on Indian goods. That's why Indian goods would become costly in England, but the British goods in India would become very much less and economic, and that's why most of the people of India, they purchase British handmade goods, British manufactured goods, and as a result of it, Indian industries which were set up in India were unable to compete with the British industries, British products. This ruined Indian industry and deprived the artisans of their income and reduced them of their employment. Besides, export of raw materials and food grains deprived India of our agricultural surplus and raised the prices of raw materials. So, the change in the nature of India's trade became an instrument for exploiting India's resources. Next point, drain of wealth. After the Battle of Plassey in the year 1757, the British captured almost all territories of India by defeating the Indian rulers. After the conquest of Bengal in the year 1757, they began to the British stopped getting gold from their country, England. Earlier, before the Battle of Plassey, the British traders used to bring golds from their country, England, in order to purchase raw cotton, raw silk from our country. But as soon as they realized that India belonged to their own country, because the Indian rulers were incompetent, unskillful, were unable to defeat the Britishers. So by defeating Indian rulers, they established their control, political, economic, social, and all control over Indian people, Indian rulers, and ultimately they stopped bringing golds from their country, England. And now, what was the reason? Not only they stopped getting gold from their country, England, but at the same time began to purchase raw materials for their industries in England from duty-free inland trade, and it began the process of plundering India's raw materials. Resources and wealth were retained, and the transfer of wealth from India to their own country, England, came to be known as drain of wealth. Drain of wealth. Our nationalist leader later wrote a beautiful book on drain of wealth named you know, poverty and a British ruler, Drain of Wealth, wrote a famous book, Poverty of Indian Poverty and Unpopular Rule in India. Who was he? He was Dadabhai Naoroji. Later on, he explained the drain theory very carefully and also proved that the wealth of India was exploited by the people of Indian land. They not only exploited Indian wealth, but they also discouraged Indian people from making, making the country rich and prosperous. Apart from this, the drain theory of Dadabhai Naoroji discouraged Indian artisans and discouraged Indian artisans because they realized that there was no hope for them. And in the famous book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, written by Dadabhai Naoroji mentioned it clearly that there was no hope for the Indian artisans and peasants of India, but only the hopes of the European artisans, European craftsmen and European industrialists. And in his famous book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, this book was duly criticized by the British because each and every point was thoroughly discussed in his famous book. Dadabhai Naoroji proved that the Britishers were exploiting Indian wealth. They are draining Indian wealth for the establishment, for making their country rich and prosperous. Besides, another point that is very important, Dadabhai Naoroji mentioned in his book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. What is this? India get no proportionate return. India got no proportionate economic return. And this system also is known as the drain of wealth. India got no proportionate economic return. This system is known as the drain of wealth. The drain included salaries, incomes, savings, the British expenditure in India on the purchase of military goods, office establishment, interest on debts, unnecessary expenditure of the army, etc., etc. So, by way of saving money at the cost of Indian wealth, Indian money, Indian revenues, the British drained Indian wealth for their country, England, and saved money for the drainage of wealth. Now, decay of cottage and handicraft industries, my dear students. What is this? Due to imposition of heavy taxes, heavy revenues, Indian handicraft industries, India's cotton industries were ruined. Due to surplus capital, due to enormous income from trade and commerce, due to huge quantities of British-made goods, due to huge quantities of supply, due to huge quantities of supplying goods for India from England, the conditions of the Indian artisans and craftsmen become very miserable. The amount, the income, whatever they used to do from their small-scale industries, handmade industries, cottage industries, these all were ruined due to British industry and its influences. Large-scale industry occupied the position of small-scale industry. British machine-made goods occupied the large market of India, and hence the Indian people were forced to purchase British goods because of its superiority. Quality was as superior as they were forced to purchase. Prices were as less as they were forced to purchase British-made goods. And only by this way, Indian cotton and handicraft industries were weak. Next point, economic decline of peasantry. Economic decline of peasantry. What is this, my dear students? The peasants were not satisfied with the officials, with the British officials. Why? Because they were forced to cultivate only the crops the British industries needed. This policy discouraged Indian peasantry. In fact, it was the peasantry that bore the heavy burden of taxes to provide money for the trade of the company, for the cost of administration of the wars of British expansion in India. For example, in Bengal, the land revenue was double the amount collected under the Mughals. Not even a part of this revenue was spent on the development of agriculture or on the welfare of the cultivator. Increasing the land revenue forced many peasants into indebtedness or into selling their lands. The traditional zamindars were replaced by merchants and moneylenders. Ultimately, these new landlords had no concern for the peasants. Ultimately, they pushed rents to exorbitant levels and evicted, their tenants in case of non-tenant. Thus, the economic decline of the peasants affected cultivation and led to many famines. The British did not want to compromise with that system they introduced because they wanted to make money at the cost of Indian peasants and farmers. They wanted to extend their trade throughout the country by hook or by crook. That's why they took help from traditional zamindars. They also helped them in order to safeguard their own interests. Next point, my dear students, growing unemployment. The traditional rulers had given financial support to Indian scholars, Indian artists, Indian painters, Indian writers, and so many distinguished people of India were patronized by the traditional rulers of India. But as soon as the traditional rulers were defeated by the Britishers stopped doing it. The Britishers stopped practicing it. The traditional rulers were practicing patronizing Indian artists, Indian painters, Indian scholars, Indian writers. But on coming of the Britishers, led to the decline of such rulers, and at the same time, the system of patronage introduced by the traditional rulers. Thus, all those who depended on their patronage were impoverished. They all became useless. This system also had become useless. When the native states were annexed to the British Dominion, thousands of soldiers and officials in administrative, military and judicial posts became unemployed. Because British policies excluded Indians from high posts, all these people became bitter enemies of the British rule in India. Naturally, the British made them their enemies. The Britishers forced the Indian people to be their enemies. They did not want to antagonize the British, but were forced to do so. Why? Because they all almost became jobless people only because of British policy of economic exploitation. Up to this, my dear students, next day the remaining part. Thank you.